I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to the gentleman from Rhode Island.
Mr. Magaziner is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to Representative Tanadar. I want to speak in favor of Ms. Jackson-Lee's amendment. The legal case for impeachment in these articles is incredibly thin, and I want everyone to understand this. In Article 1, the argument that House Republicans are making is that somehow Secretary Mayorkas is choosing not to follow the law because a portion of migrants apprehended at the border are not being detained until their cases are heard. But again, there is not enough detention capacity because this Congress has not provided that funding for that capacity. Stats and numbers don't lie. For fiscal year 2024, and I want everyone to hear this, Congress provided funding for 34,000 beds in ICE detention centers, 34,000. The average daily population in those detention centers is 37,000 people. They are at capacity. So there may be individual examples of certain facilities at certain times that are not at capacity for safety reasons or health reasons or whatever the case may be. But overall, across the system, we are at and above capacity. And so what should the Secretary do? The Secretary, because he has not received the funding to provide adequate detention capacity, has to use his judgment for who to detain and who to release. That is not illegal. It is certainly not impeachable. And it is the exact same kind of discretion that every other director before him has used. In the last 2 years of the Trump administration, 52% of migrants apprehended at the southern border were released, not detained. 52%, nearly 1 million people. I did not hear my Republican colleagues trying to impeach the secretary or acting secretary under the Trump administration during those years, but here they are trying to impeach Secretary Mayorkas for doing the exact same thing. And in fact, the percentage of migrants who have been released under the Biden administration, 48%, is lower than the 52% rate under the last 2 years of the Trump administration. In Article 2, and that's, by the way, that is essentially their whole argument in Article 1, so we can forget that. Article 2, they are arguing that somehow the Secretary has lied to Congress because at various times he said things like the border was secure or the border was closed. These are subjective terms. Again, certainly not impeachable. If he said, you know, we're holding an average daily count of 37,000 people a day when it was really 10,000 a day, well, that would be a lie. That would be misstating a fact. But characterizing the situation on the ground in a way that my Republican colleagues might disagree with is certainly not impeachable or a lie. If I say to you, it's hot outside and you think it's cold, I haven't lied to you. If I say to you it's 80 degrees and it's actually 40 degrees, well, that might be a lie.
Would the gentleman yield?
But I'll just say once again, you're talking about terms like closed, secure, that are inherently subjective terms. Oh, okay. I mean, there are certain terms like operationally secure that may have a legal definition, but again, the idea that this would be an impeachable offense is ludicrous. There is no law that my colleagues have pointed to that has been broken, and particularly when it comes to the Secretary using his discretion to decide how to manage the lack of capacity because Congress has not provided the resources that he has asked for. He's using the same discretion that every secretary before him has used.
The gentleman yield quick for
yield to Mr. Goldman.
Just to follow up on Mr. Magaziner's point on the operational control of the border, as that term is defined in the Secure Fence Act of 2006, that, of course, requires 0 immigrants from crossing the border in order to achieve that standard. And of course, that's unreasonable, unattainable. So in 2007, under the Bush administration, the department issued guidelines to redefine what operational control is. So if you are actually trying to point to this and the letter of the law, then you ought to talk to your colleagues in the Wayback Machine in 2007 who changed that definition.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the
The
gentleman-
gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mrs. Green for 5 minutes to comment on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're listening to Democrats today talk about Secretary Mayorkas requesting funding from Congress and talking about detention space. But the facts tell the truth. Secretary Mayorkas has requested less detention space. Fiscal year 2020, $2.7 billion for 54,000 beds, including 2,500 for family units. Fiscal year 2021, $3.1 billion for 60,000 beds, including 5,000 for family units. Fiscal year 2022, he requested $1.8 billion for 32,500 beds. Fiscal year 2023, he requested $1.4 billion for 25,000 beds. And in fiscal year 2024, Secretary Mayorkas reduced it again down to $1.3 billion for 25,000 beds. This is a reduction of 9,000 from fiscal year 23 enacted. DHS has not provided Congress with statutorily mandated reports on detention needs as required under 8 U.S.C. 1368 and requested by the committee in a letter on January 4th, 2024. Also, DHS claims in fiscal year 22 and 23 budget requests that a reduction in detention capacity level will not impede ICE's ability to apprehend, detain, and remove non-citizens that present a threat to national security, border security, and public safety. Secretary Mayorkas closed detention facilities, closed them, while paroling en masse millions of illegal aliens into our country. By December 2021, DHS stopped using family detention centers for family units. In March 2022, ICE announced it would close an Alabama detention facility and limit the use of 3 others in Florida, Louisiana, and North Carolina. Secretary Mayorkas refused to utilize MPP. But let's talk about what has been the result of that. Human trafficking is a $150 billion a year industry. And what has this done for the cartels? Cartels and coyotes are making over $13 billion a year in human trafficking alone off of Secretary Mayorkas's willful breaking of federal immigration laws. This revenue is 26 times more than cartels earned under President Trump. Approximately $500 million under Trump, according to the New York Times. But what is that doing? This is trafficking children, trafficking women. This is what he is not holding these people. He is not detaining these people. He's not coming to us and asking us for more money. He's asking us for less money. He's asking us for less beds. And then he's closing down detention facilities. It is an outright lie to claim that Secretary Mayorkas is following the law when in fact he's not. He is breaking the law. And he is paroling them by the millions into the interior of the United States. What else has happened since then? Fentanyl, the #1 killer for Americans between ages 18 and 45. Let's also talk about how many Americans are dying. 300 Americans a day are dying. Let's talk about what that does to people like 2 of my constituents, Jose and Isabel Lerma, who were killed in a human smuggling pursuit caused by Mayorkas's open border policies. What about 20-year-old Kayla Marie Hamilton? Remember her mother? Poor Kayla was raped and strangled to death by an illegal MS-13 gang member who was actually apprehended at the border. Apprehended. He had gang tattoos on his body. But because Secretary Mayorkas breaks federal law, he says, go ahead and release these people into our country. And this 20-year-old was raped and murdered by an MS-13 gang member who should have never been in the United States. This is the outcome. That's just one example. We could spend hours and hours. You know what? We could go all week, and I'm sure Chairman Green would let us do it if we talked about every American who has been affected by Secretary Mayorkas willfully breaking federal immigration law. Is that what we must do? If we must, we must. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Payne for 5 minutes discussing the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield to Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Jackson Lee.
I thank the gentleman, and forgive me, Mr. Magazine, that I didn't thank you when you yielded. Thank you so very much. Let me give us all a suggestion. Let us move to adjourn this meeting and have an authorization meeting, because my heart goes out to every single victim that has suffered a loss of life, being a family member or who's died in this terrible scourge of drug trafficking or fentanyl. And let's have a meeting that deals with authorizing Secretary Mayorkas $20 billion to be able to do the job that we understand he has not done, because he has not asked for $1 billion, $2 billion, $5 billion, $6 billion, $7 billion. It goes to the very point that we are making. These are policy decisions. These are decisions that the Budget Committee participates in, the Appropriations Committee participates in. And it may be in the overall discussion of the budget of this nation or appropriations that the Secretary was given the amount that he could work with, policy. And it wasn't a constitutional decision. It was, this is the budget for DHS. And the billions that you are asking or maybe need will have to be dropped down. And so I can't for the life of me see why my colleagues cannot understand that you are dealing clearly with the issue of a policy decision and a very wise secretary that is trying to do his job by protecting us in the narrow way that he's allowed to do so. Here are my resources. Here is who I can detain. And for the information of this committee, many Republicans want to use our immigration and criminal justice system to solve public health crises or blame the secretary. Under President Biden's leadership, overdose deaths have decreased or been flat each month for 6 consecutive months. As well, we have reported, based on a rolling 12-month count, with significant increases during the final year of the Trump administration. We didn't have that. With Democrats, we've been working to bring it down and to stop the scourge of drug trafficking. In September 2021, during the first year of the Biden administration, the DOJ and DEA announced law enforcement surge that resulted in the seizure of far more of these fentanyl pills and other horrible aspects. And so the real question is, how long are we going to pursue a question of behavior under your job versus direct acts that result in the death of people? Are you telling me Secretary Mayorkas was directly involved in killing people? Would we go to that length? Would we so much even suggest that the smugglers and the cartels gaining profits have now rendered under Secretary Mayorkas under Article 2 that talks about the breach of trust? Or has he benefited monetarily? Who would want to stand and say that? And so we're getting to a point now where it really is a question of understanding. And that understanding is that Article 1 does not fit any of the charges that the Republicans are making against this gentleman. They're not constitutionally grounded. And we have not allowed the secretary, who is now engaged in negotiations now for over a month, I believe, or more, with the Senate, a very table that the House Republicans have been invited to sit at, the very table that the Speaker of the House has been invited to sit at, and my understanding is that their seats are vacant. But yet our Secretary of Homeland Security, under the threat of impeachment, at every point has gotten up every day to participate in abiding by laws that he hopes will make this country safer. Is that the basis of impeachment? Is that the accusation that will hold under this Article 1? Mr. Chairman, it will not hold, and I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee Amendment and vote down Article 1.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
thank
I
you.
now recognize Mr. Guest for 5 minutes to discuss the amendment to the amendment.
Briefly, Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment. I do disagree with Ms. Jackson-Lee when she says that members of the House have been asked to sit at the table during these Senate negotiations. That is completely untrue. You've not been asked. Ranking Member Thompson has not been asked. These negotiations are taking place behind closed doors in secret, and we have no input whatsoever. And so for any member to say that House Republicans have refused to participate is just a complete misstatement of fact. I also disagree with my colleagues. We can argue whether or not lying to Congress should be impeachable, but I don't believe we can say that what Secretary Mayorkas has said time and time and time again is not untruthful, is not a lie. I'll give you quotes. Congressman Pfluger asked him in 2023, is the border more secure under your leadership than when you started? Secretary Mayorkas said, Congressman, the border is secure. This is my time, Mr. Magazine. I'd like to read the statements of your Homeland Security Secretary, who has misled Congress repeatedly. I asked Secretary Mayorkas, are you saying that all 9 sectors are secure? His testimony was, it is my testimony that the border is secure. I later asked him again that in light of the statements made by Chief Ortiz, is the border secure? And he said, Congressman, I stand by my prior assessment. Mr. Bishop asked him, I've heard you in the Judiciary Committee recently this summer testify the border is secure. Secretary Mayorkas, do you continue to maintain that the border is secure? His answer was yes. I asked Mr. Mayorkas on another occasion, so my question to you, Mr. Secretary, are you testifying as you sit here today that the southwest border is secure? His answer, yes, I am. And then when questioned at some point by Ms. Jackson-Lee, his response was, Congresswoman, the border is secure and the border is not open. In a hearing in which Representative Roy asked him as it relates to the Secure Fencing Act, Congressman Roy says, do we have operational control of the border? Secretary Mayorkas, yes, we do. And Congressman, we're working to, and then he doesn't finish that statement. And so we may argue whether or not that is impeachable, but I don't think we can argue whether or not he has been truthful, because his statements in and of themselves are distruthful. How can we say that the border is secure when last month, nationwide, there were over 370,000 immigrants come across the border?
Would the gentleman yield?
I yield to the chairman.
So I also think it's very important to point out, as you brought up the Chip Roy testimony in Judiciary, that Chip Roy read the definition of operational control from the law passed by Congress, and said, do you have operational control by this definition? And the Secretary said, yes. In another hearing, he had already said, I don't know if it came first, I want to be very clear here, which came first, before this in another hearing or after. Mr. Secretary said, no one has ever had control by that definition. So it's not whether it's warm or cold outside. There is a very clear definition in the code for operational security. He was asked, read the definition and asked if we had operational control by the definition, and he said yes. And later or before, and I'll have to get the date on it, he admitted that no one's ever had control, which is a false statement. I mean, that is a false statement. Knowing the definition, knowing that no one had ever had control. In fact, Mr. Biden, just a few days ago, President Biden said no one's had control for 10 years. Mr. Mayorkas lied to Congress, and he lied to Congress.
The gentleman yield.
And I yield back to Mr. Guest.
Mr. Green, thank you, Chairman. In my last few seconds, I do want to reiterate the point that you just made, that the President himself, within the last several weeks, has made statements that contradict everything that Secretary Mayorkas has testified repeatedly. The President of the United States said not only is the border not secure, but the border has not been secured for well over a decade. So the border has not been secured at any time in which Biden has been president. Under his statement, the border was not secured when Donald Trump was president. And under his statement, the border was not secured when he was vice president. And so Mr. Mayorkas has lied to Congress. He has breached the public trust. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment to the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Goldman, you are recognized.
So secure is a term of art, as you know. Operational control and secure of the border is under the Secure Fence Act of 2006. The Department of Homeland Security under George Bush in 2007 recognized that it's an impossible standard, and they implemented rules and regulations by which the department has operated since 2007 under the Bush administration, Obama administration, Trump administration, and Biden administration. And so when Secretary Mayorkas says it is secure according to the guidelines that oversee the Department of Homeland Security. Nobody is escorted into this country. But I want to talk about Ms. Jackson Lee's amendment because it is one that I fully support, and I want to focus on a reason that we haven't talked about very much, which is the complete lawlessness of this impeachment process. This was referred to this committee for impeachment, but that does not mean that prior impeachments are irrelevant as precedent. Prior impeachments have always allowed for due process to the individual who is being impeached.
Right.
President Trump got it in 2019, and every single individual judge, president, or otherwise has gotten heightened due process standards where they were permitted to provide evidence, provide testimony, call witnesses, cross-examine the witnesses. What we had in this impeachment process was one hearing where the Republican witnesses were all state attorneys general who are suing the Biden administration. Pretty clear conflict of interest. No impeachment knowledge or expertise. And another hearing where we heard stories, tragic stories from parents of children who have died. And Ms. Green says we should stay here and talk about all of the anecdotes of individuals who have died from at the hands of those who should not have come across. Well, I'll tell you what would be much, much longer than that is going through every single victim of mass shootings around this country with assault weapons that have no place in our civilian society. 2 a day. That would take a lot longer than everything else. So we're here in an impeachment process that has no due process. There is absolutely no legal analysis of any of these articles of impeachment, which are unprecedented and have been made up out of whole cloth. And then in Article 1, which is what we're talking about here, the gist of it, as my colleague from Rhode Island said, is that Secretary Mayorkas has failed to secure the border, and the specific examples generally relate to his failure to follow the law and detain everyone. Now, I would add, of course, Ms. Green is wrong in the President's supplemental appropriations request. The President did ask for more funding for ICE detention. He asked for more funding for Border Patrol agents, for asylum officers, for immigration judges, for USCIS officials to process everything, because we have such a backlog of the asylum process. But he's being impeached right now because he did not put everyone in jail. That's what we said. Now, Mr. Bishop then responded saying, no. Well, obviously there are some circumstances when not everyone can be detained, and in those circumstances, then not everybody should be detained. So I figured it out. We have the impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas, because the law says that immigrants shall be detained unless it is the judgment of Representative Dan Bishop of North Carolina that they are exempt from detention.